I was thrown the abortion consent form in my face by my husband Marcus, because he needed a clean record to marry the daughter of a billionaire media tycoon. The sharp edge of the stiff paper sliced across my cheekbone before fluttering to the cold marble floor like a death sentence signed in blood. Marcus stood over me, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror with the indifference of a man disposing of expired milk. Refusing to look at my 7-month pregnant belly, which he now called a malignant tumor on his political career, he pointed a manicured finger at the document that demanded I terminate the pregnancy immediately or induce labor early to give the child away to an anonymous orphanage in the countryside. I tried to speak to defend the life kicking inside me, but my throat was dry from hours of begging and the lack of water. He checked his gold Rolex and told me I had exactly 1 hour to sign the papers. Or he would make a personal call to the director of Mount Sinai Hospital to cut the power to my mother's life support system. The cruelty of his ultimatum made my knees weak, but I forced myself to stand because kneeling to a devil would not save us. The sprawling Sterling mansion was freezing because he had ordered the staff to turn off the heating in my wing to break my spirit, leaving me shivering in a thin nightgown while the snowstorm raged outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. I told him he was a monster without a soul, but he just laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the empty walls, and pulled out his phone to swipe open the security app linked to the VIP ward where my mother lay in a coma. The screen showed my mother frail and unconscious, with the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, dependent entirely on the machine he paid for with the money I had helped him earn. He tapped the screen with a cruel smile and said that electricity was expensive, and he was currently in the process of liquidating unnecessary assets to merge with the Vanderbilt family empire. He looked at me with dead eyes and said that Chloe Vanderbilt did not like stepchildren, and she certainly did not want a scandal involving his ex-wife dragging down her stock prices. The room felt like a meat locker, not just because of the broken heating system he refused to fix for me, but because of the sheer malice radiating from the man I once loved and supported for 10 years. He poured himself a glass of aged scotch and said he would wait in the study while I made the only logical financial decision of my life, leaving me alone with the paper that would end my child's life. I knew signing meant death for my soul, but refusing meant physical death for my mother. So I chose the third option, which was total mutual destruction. I grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the side table and smashed it against the reinforced glass window to create a distraction. The sound of shattering glass piercing the silence of the house. The shards of glass cut into my bare feet as I climbed through the frame, but the adrenaline masked the pain as I pushed through the heavy oak doors into the blizzard outside. The biting wind of the New York winter hit me like a physical blow, and the snow blinded me instantly, turning the world into a white void of freezing death. I heard the shouting of his private security team behind me, and the barking of guard dogs that were trained to hunt intruders, their paws thudding heavily against the frozen ground. I scrambled over the icy pavement, clutching my stomach to protect the baby, while slipping on the black ice that covered the driveway, my breath coming in ragged gasps that burned my lungs. A hand grabbed my shoulder, and I bit down hard on the gloved fingers until I tasted leather and sweat, causing the guard to recoil just enough for me to slip through the electronic gate before it fully closed. My lungs burned as I ran blindly into the middle of the street, where the headlights of oncoming traffic cut through the swirling white chaos like the eyes of predators. I was a fugitive in my own marriage, running from the man who had sworn to protect me, with nothing but a thin nightgown and the desperation of a mother who had lost everything. The sound of a high-performance engine roared closer, and I froze like a deer caught in the sights of a hunter, unable to move my frozen limbs. I saw the massive silver grille of a Rolls-Royce Phantom emerging from the fog, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact that would end this nightmare once and for all. The screech of tires on asphalt pierced my ears as the massive vehicle swerved violently and came to a halt just inches from my trembling body, the heat from the engine washing over my frozen skin. I collapsed onto the freezing ground, gasping for air while the snow began to bury me, waiting for death or salvation. I looked up to see a polished leather shoe step out onto the gray slush, followed by a man in a bespoke charcoal suit who looked down at me not with concern, but with profound annoyance. Damon Blackwood loomed over me like a dark god of Wall Street, holding a black umbrella that shielded him from the storm while I lay exposed to the elements. He did not offer a hand or ask if I was injured. Instead, he tilted his head and remarked that I looked like a discarded wrapper from a cheap fast food joint that was littering his path. I recognized him immediately as the corporate raider who had been trying to hostilely take over Sterling Enterprises for years. A man known for his ruthlessness and lack of empathy. I grabbed the hem of his expensive trousers and begged him to help me, promising him the one thing he wanted more than money, which was the total destruction of Marcus Sterling. He paused and looked at his security detail before crouching down to my level. His cologne mixing with the smell of ozone and snow. His eyes were cold and calculating as he whispered that he did not run a charity for runaway wives. But he was always in the market for insider information that could destroy a competitor. He told his driver to open the door, but warned me that if I bled on his upholstery, he would deduct the cleaning fee from whatever value I thought I had. I forced my way into the back seat, leaving a trail of blood and melted snow on the pristine interior, shaking uncontrollably from hypothermia and terror. Damon sat opposite me, pouring himself a sparkling water, and handed me a tablet displaying a live stock chart of my husband's company, which was currently trading at an all-time high. He told me that if I wanted my mother to live, I had to give him the password to the offshore accounts Marcus used to launder money. Right here and right now. I typed the code with trembling fingers, and watched as Damon made a single phone call to his legal team to freeze those assets immediately. My phone buzzed with a video call from Marcus, who was standing in my mother's hospital room with his hand on the power cord of the ventilator. I screamed, but Damon took the phone from my hand and turned the camera to face himself, his expression bored and dangerous. He smiled a shark-like smile and told Marcus that if he pulled that plug, he would be charged with first-degree murder because the woman in the bed was now the mother-in-law of Damon Blackwood. He ended the call, leaving Marcus staring at a blank screen, while I passed out from exhaustion into the darkness of the car. I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor that sounded like a countdown to an execution, and the sterile scent of antiseptic that burned my nostrils. My heavy eyelids fluttered open to reveal a ceiling that was far too high and far too clean to be a hospital room, painted in a shade of gray that screamed expensive minimalism. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my lower abdomen, forcing a gasp from my dry throat as I realized an IV line was taped to the back of my hand, pumping warm fluids into my frozen veins. I was lying in a king-sized bed covered in sheets of Egyptian cotton that felt like silk against my skin, in a room that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a sanctuary for a pregnant woman. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline of Manhattan glittered coldly in the night, a sprawling ocean of lights that cared nothing for the people drowning beneath them. Sitting in a leather armchair by the window was Damon Blackwood, reading a stack of documents with the intense focus of a predator studying a map of a hunting ground, a glass of amber liquid resting untouched on the table beside him. He did not look up when I stirred, but simply turned a page with a crisp sound that cut through the silence, his presence filling the room with a suffocating weight that made the air feel thin. I pulled the duvet tighter around my chest as a shield against his gaze, and asked hoarsely where I was and if my baby was still alive. Damon finally closed the folder and stood up, walking toward the bed with slow, deliberate steps that echoed on the hardwood floor, his face an unreadable mask of indifference. He stopped at the foot of the bed and told me that my vital signs were stable. The fetus was distressed but currently safe, and I was in his penthouse on the Upper East Side. He tossed a thick document onto the bed near my legs, the heavy paper landing with a thud that felt heavier than the abortion consent form Marcus had thrown at me earlier that night. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read the title printed in bold black letters, my breath catching in my throat as I realized it was a marriage contract. It was not a proposal born of romance or even kindness, but a business acquisition agreement that detailed the terms of a merger between two entities, with me listed as the acquired asset. Damon crossed his arms over his chest and explained calmly that if I wanted his protection against Marcus Sterling, I had to belong to him legally. because the law did not protect ex-wives, but it certainly protected current spouses. I stared at the clauses that outlined my duties, which included complete obedience in public appearances and the total transfer of all my knowledge regarding Sterling Enterprises to Blackwood Holdings. I looked up at him with tears stinging my eyes and asked if he was any different from Marcus, since he was also using my desperation to force me into a corner. Damon leaned down, placing his hands on the mattress on either side of my legs, trapping me in his space as he whispered that the difference was honest transaction versus emotional manipulation. He told me that Marcus wanted me dead or compliant to save his reputation, whereas he wanted me alive and angry to use as a weapon, which gave me a much higher survival rate. He checked his watch and informed me that Marcus had already filed a police report claiming I had been kidnapped by a mentally unstable rival, and the NYPD was currently 10 minutes away from this building with a warrant to retrieve me. The mention of the police made my blood run cold, because I knew Marcus had the commissioner in his pocket, and if I was returned to that house, I would never see the light of day again. Damon uncapped a gold fountain pen and held it out to me, his eyes challenging me to make the choice between becoming a prisoner of war or a partner in crime. The pen felt cold and heavy in my hand like a dagger, and for a moment I hesitated, thinking of the sanctity of marriage that I had once believed in. But then I remembered the image of Marcus standing over my mother's life support machine, and the way he had looked at my unborn child with pure disgust. I realized that sanctity was a luxury for the safe, and I was currently standing on the edge of a cliff with wolves snapping at my heels. I pressed the nib to the paper and signed my name with a flourish of defiance, the ink flowing dark and permanent, sealing my fate to the devil standing before me. Damon took the document the moment I finished and handed it to a man in a suit who had been standing silently in the shadows, a notary who stamped it immediately with a mechanical clunk. Damon straightened his jacket and told me to get dressed because we were about to have guests, pointing to a designer dress hanging on the closet door that was large enough to accommodate my pregnancy. I had barely finished pulling the velvet fabric over my head when the sound of sirens wailed from the street below, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. The elevator doors to the penthouse slid open with a soft chime, and the peace of the apartment was shattered by the heavy tread of boots and the shouting of authoritative voices. Marcus Sterling strode into the living room, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a detective I recognized from the society pages, his face a perfect mask of distraught concern. He spotted me standing by the fireplace and rushed forward with his arms outstretched, crying out my name and acting as if he had been searching for me in agony for hours. He told the officers that I was suffering from prenatal psychosis and had been lured away by a dangerous man, begging them to help him get his poor wife to a psychiatric facility for her own safety. I shrank back against the cold marble of the mantelpiece, disgusted by his performance and terrified that the police would believe his well-rehearsed lies. The detective stepped forward with his hand resting on his holster and ordered Damon to step away from the female victim and to put his hands where they could be seen. The air in the room crackled with tension, and I saw the security team of Blackwood stiffen, ready to engage if the police made a move. Damon did not raise his hands, nor did he step away. Instead, he took a sip of his drink and looked at the detective with the amused expression of a man watching a toddler throw a tantrum. He asked the officer if he usually barged into private residences without checking the facts, or if he was just following the payroll instructions of Mr. Sterling. Marcus turned red with rage and shouted that Damon was a kidnapper who was holding a pregnant woman hostage, demanding that the police arrest him immediately for unlawful imprisonment. Damon set his glass down on the coaster with a deliberate click and walked over to the table where the notary was organizing the papers. He picked up the marriage certificate, which had been expedited through his vast network of judicial connections, and held it up for the detective to see. He stated clearly and coldly that there was no kidnapping here, because a husband could not kidnap his own wife, especially when she was under his roof by her own free will. The detective squinted at the document, his aggressive stance faltering as he read the names and the official seal of the city clerk. Marcus froze in the middle of his fake sobbing, his eyes bulging as he processed the words that Damon had just spoken. He snatched the paper from the detective's hand and scanned it frantically, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his tie. He screamed that it was a forgery and a lie, claiming that we were not divorced yet, so I could not possibly be married to another man. Damon smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and pulled out another document from the stack, a digital copy of the divorce decree that Marcus himself had drafted and forged my signature on weeks ago to show Chloe. Damon reminded him that in his haste to clear the path for his new heiress bride, he had filed the papers electronically this morning, making Elena legally single as of noon today. The irony hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had dug his own grave by trying to bury me too quickly. The detective looked from Marcus to Damon, realizing he had been played, and signaled his men to lower their weapons. I stepped forward from the fireplace, my hand resting protectively on my stomach, and looked Marcus dead in the eye for the first time without fear. I told the detective that I was not crazy, and I was not kidnapped, but I was terrified of my ex-husband who had threatened to kill my child. I pointed at Marcus and stated that if he ever came near me or my family again, I would press charges for domestic abuse and attempted murder. Marcus lunged at me with a snarl of pure hatred, but Damon stepped in between us, his broad back forming an impenetrable wall. Damon told the officers that if they did not remove this trespasser from his property in the next 30 seconds, his lawyers would sue the department for harassment, and the commissioner would be looking for a new job by morning. The detective, sensing a career-ending political disaster, grabbed Marcus by the arm and firmly escorted him toward the elevator, ignoring his threats and curses. As the doors closed on Marcus's distorted face, the silence returned to the penthouse. But it was no longer empty. It was charged with the electricity of a battle just begun. Damon turned to me, the adrenaline fading from his posture to reveal the cold calculator underneath. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply pointed to the guest bedroom and told me to get some rest because tomorrow the real work would begin. He said that by morning, the news of our marriage would be on the front page of every financial newspaper in the country, and the stock of Sterling Enterprises would begin to wobble. He warned me that I was no longer Elena the victim. I was now Mrs. Blackwood, the weapon, and he expected his weapons to be sharp and ready for war. I walked to the bedroom door and paused, looking back at the man who had just saved my life by selling it to a different kind of hell. I realized that I had traded a butcher for a general, and while the general might send me to the front lines, at least he gave me a gun instead of leading me to the slaughterhouse. I closed the door and collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the ring on my finger feeling heavier than shackles, listening to the wind howl outside, knowing that the storm was far from over. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite of the penthouse, staring at a stranger draped in a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than my father had earned in his entire lifetime. The team of stylists Damon had hired worked with the precision of a bomb disposal squad, pinning and tucking the fabric to accentuate my 7-month pregnancy rather than hide it, turning my physical vulnerability into a statement of defiant power. Damon entered the room adjusting his onyx cufflinks, his eyes scanning me, not with the affection of a husband, but with the critical appraisal of an investor checking a stock portfolio before the market opens. He handed me a diamond necklace that felt cold and heavy against my skin, whispering that tonight was not a social visit but a hostile takeover of the public narrative regarding the Sterling divorce. I asked him why we were going to the engagement party of the man who tried to kill my child, and he replied that the best way to destroy a man like Marcus was to let him see exactly what he had thrown away, thriving in the hands of his greatest enemy. He pulled me close with a grip that was firm and possessive, telling me to keep my chin up because if I looked down for even a second, the sharks in that ballroom would smell blood and tear me apart. The limousine glided to a stop in front of the Plaza Hotel where the paparazzi swarmed like locusts, their cameras flashing in a blinding rhythm that disoriented me and turned the night into a strobe-lit nightmare. Damon stepped out first, commanding the chaos with a single raised hand before turning to help me descend, his movement deliberately slow to let every lens capture the way he treated me like precious porcelain. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as they recognized the discarded ex-wife of Marcus Sterling. Now draped in diamonds, and holding the arm of Wall Street's most feared corporate raider. I felt a wave of nausea as we walked the red carpet, hearing the whispers of gold digger and traitor, mixed with grudging admiration for the sheer audacity of our arrival at my ex-husband's celebration. We entered the ballroom, which was decorated with enough white roses to bury a small country, the scent of expensive perfume and hypocrisy hanging thick in the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of forced gaiety. Marcus and Chloe stood on a raised platform accepting congratulations, looking like the perfect royal couple until their eyes landed on us, and their smiles cracked like cheap porcelain dropped on concrete. Chloe Vanderbilt descended the stairs with the grace of a viper, her white designer gown trailing behind her as she marched towards us, her eyes fixed on my stomach with undisguised disgust and malice. She stopped inches from my face, holding a glass of red wine that teetered dangerously, and sneered that she did not know the event planners had invited the cleaning staff to her private celebration. She raised her voice so the nearby guests, including several major shareholders, could hear, asking if I had come to beg for alimony or if I was just looking for leftovers from the buffet to feed my bastard child. I felt the old Elena wanting to shrink away and apologize for existing, but the cold weight of the diamond around my neck reminded me of the contract I had signed and the role I had to play. I looked at her with a calm smile that I did not feel, and replied that I was actually here to inspect the assets my husband was planning to acquire, starting with her family's failing media conglomerate. Chloe turned a shade of crimson that matched the wine she was holding, and her hand twitched as if she wanted to throw the liquid in my face to wash away my composure and ruin the silk. Before Chloe could tilt the glass, Damon stepped forward with a smoothness that was terrifying, his hand gently intercepting her wrist with a grip that looked polite to onlookers, but was clearly immovable. He took the glass from her trembling hand and set it on a passing tray, telling her in a low voice that spilling a vintage Cabernet on a dress worth $200,000 would bankrupt her personal allowance for the next decade. The room fell silent as the guests processed the number, their eyes darting between my custom gown and Chloe's off-the-rack designer dress, which suddenly looked cheap by comparison. Damon continued in a voice that carried effortlessly across the room, announcing that he had just purchased the majority debt of the Vanderbilt Group this afternoon, effectively making him her father's boss. He looked at Marcus, who had rushed over to defend his fiancée, and added that, technically speaking, he now owned the mortgage on this very hotel ballroom, so they were partying on his property. The humiliation on Chloe's face was total and absolute, her status as the superior heiress shattering instantly under the crushing weight of superior capital and leverage. Marcus stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, his gaze lingering on the curve of my waist and the glow of my skin that he had once called pale and sickly during our marriage. He stepped past Chloe, ignoring her tears of embarrassment, and reached out a hand towards me, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant to be intimate, but sounded pathetic to my ears. He said that I should not let Damon manipulate me, claiming that he was the father of the child, and that we could work something out if I just came back to him quietly without making a scene. I looked at the man I had wasted 10 years on, seeing not a powerful CEO but a desperate gambler who had folded a winning hand too early and was now trying to bluff his way back into the game. I took a step back and placed a hand on my stomach, telling him that the father of this child was a man who would never force a mother to choose between her baby and her dignity. Damon wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me into his side, telling Marcus that he had lost his voting rights in this family the moment he signed those fake divorce papers to impress a mistress. The victory was sweet but short-lived as Marcus's expression shifted from regret to a cold reptilian malice that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up in warning. He leaned in close, pretending to brush a piece of invisible lint from Damon's lapel, and hissed that while Damon might own the debt, Marcus still owned the private hospital where a certain elderly woman was currently sleeping. He smiled a cruel smile and mentioned that there was a power outage scheduled for maintenance in the ICU wing later tonight, and backup generators were known to fail in this severe winter weather. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me that he was willing to commit indirect murder to regain control. using my mother as the ultimate leverage to force my submission. Damon tightened his grip on me, his eyes promising retribution that would leave nothing but scorched earth. But for now, we were trapped in a public stalemate. Marcus raised his glass in a mock toast to the happy couple, sipping his champagne while I felt the phantom sensation of a ventilator stopping, the clock ticking down on my mother's life. We exited the Plaza Hotel with the urgency of a tactical retreat, moving through the blinding flashes of the paparazzi, who were now shouting questions that had turned from curious to accusatory. Damon shielded my face with his jacket as we pushed through the mob, his body forming a barrier against the microphones that were being thrust at us like spears. Once we were sealed inside the soundproof cabin of the limousine, the silence was instantly shattered by the relentless buzzing of our phones, signaling a coordinated media attack that was hitting us from every digital angle. Damon unlocked his tablet and swiped through a series of breaking news alerts, his jaw tightening with each headline that flashed across the screen in bold red letters. Marcus had not just threatened my mother. He had unleashed a scorched earth campaign to destroy my reputation before I could destroy his company, leaking falsified medical records to the tabloids. The headlines were brutal and specific, claiming that I was carrying the child of a chauffeur and had tricked Damon Blackwood into a marriage fraud to pay off gambling debts. The stock ticker for Blackwood Holdings on the sidebar began to bleed red, dropping 3% in 10 minutes as investors panicked at the scandal of their CEO marrying a liability. I stared at the screen where a doctored photo showed me entering a motel room I had never visited, and I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. Not for myself, but for the man who had staked his reputation on me. Damon tossed the tablet onto the leather seat and picked up the secure phone to call his PR crisis team, his voice low and dangerous as he ordered them to bury the story or find new jobs by morning. I reached out and placed my hand over his, stopping him from issuing a defensive statement that would only make us look guilty of the accusations. I looked into his furious eyes and told him that defense was for the innocent. But we were not innocent. We were executioners who needed to strike back harder. I asked him to give me his laptop and access to the secure server of the Securities and Exchange Commission, a request that made him pause and look at me with a mixture of doubt and curiosity. I told him that for 5 years I had balanced the books for Sterling Enterprises, and while Marcus was careful, he was also arrogant enough to think his wife was too stupid to understand the complex web of shell companies he used to evade federal taxes. I typed rapidly on the keyboard, my fingers remembering the account numbers and routing codes that I had memorized in secret during late nights when Marcus was out with his mistresses. I pulled up the hidden ledgers of 3 offshore entities named Apex, Nova, and Zenith, which were registered in the Cayman Islands under the names of his deceased relatives. I turned the screen toward Damon and pointed to a series of transactions totaling $50 million that had been funneled out of the employee pension fund and into these private accounts just last week. Damon scanned the data, his eyes widening as he realized I had just handed him a nuclear weapon in the form of a spreadsheet. He did not smile, but the tension in his shoulders released as he picked up the phone again, this time dialing a direct line to the assistant director of the FBI who owed him a favor. He spoke 2 sentences, giving the federal agents the exact location of the physical servers inside the Sterling building and the password to decrypt them. We watched the live news feed on the car's television as the headline changed from my alleged infidelity to a breaking report of federal agents raiding the Sterling headquarters in Midtown. The limousine tore through the snow-covered streets of Manhattan, ignoring red lights as we raced toward the private hospital where my mother was being held hostage by a failing power grid. The satisfaction of seeing Marcus being escorted out of his office by agents and windbreakers was dampened by the terrified knot in my stomach that told me a cornered rat would bite before it died. We screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance of the Mount Sinai VIP wing, where the lights were flickering ominously, confirming that Marcus had indeed tampered with the electrical supply as he had threatened. Damon kicked the car door open and pulled a heavy flashlight from the side pocket, leading the way into the darkened lobby where the receptionists were huddled in confusion. We bypassed the elevators, which were grounded due to the power surge, and ran up 4 flights of stairs. my breath coming in ragged gasps as I clutched my heavy stomach. We burst into the corridor of the intensive care unit, expecting to see nurses scrambling or security guards blocking our path. But the hallway was eerily silent and deserted. I ran to room 402, my heart pounding so hard against my ribs that it drowned out the hum of the backup generators that were struggling to keep the floor alive. I pushed the door open and froze, my scream dying in my throat as the beam of Damon's flashlight cut through the darkness to reveal an empty bed. The ventilator was unplugged and silent. The sheets were stripped, and the monitors were dark, leaving no trace that my mother had ever been there. There was no body, no note, and no sign of a struggle. Just the terrifying void where a human life should have been. A nurse emerged from the shadows of the supply closet, trembling with fear as she recognized me, and whispered that men in black suits with private ambulance markings had come 20 minutes ago. She said they had transferred the patient under the authority of a medical power of attorney, signed by Marcus Sterling, claiming she needed to be moved to a specialized facility for her safety. Damon punched the wall in frustration, creating a spiderweb of cracks in the plaster. Realizing that Marcus had anticipated the FBI raid and had moved his leverage before the handcuffs slapped onto his wrists. My knees gave way and I sank to the floor, realizing that while we had struck his wallet, he had successfully stolen my heart. I collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor of the empty hospital room, my hands clawing at the space where my mother's bed had been just moments ago, while the silence of the room screamed louder than any alarm. Damon did not waste time offering empty platitudes or holding my hand. Instead, he pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a number that did not appear in any public directory, activating a network of private investigators and former intelligence officers who operated in the shadows of the city. He barked orders into the receiver with the precision of a field commander, demanding the license plate number of every private ambulance that had departed from the service entrance in the last 30 minutes, and authorizing a bounty of $1 million for the location of the vehicle. My phone vibrated in my pocket with a caller ID that displayed the name of Marcus's lead defense attorney, a shark named Harrison, who was known for burying moral decency under billable hours. I answered with trembling fingers, putting it on speaker so Damon could hear the voice that slithered out like oil, informing me that his client was currently in federal custody, but had authorized a generous settlement offer. The lawyer stated calmly that if I wanted to see my mother alive again, I needed to publicly recant my statement to the FBI and claim that the financial documents were fabricated by me due to a hormonal imbalance, effectively destroying my own credibility and saving Marcus from prison. The lawyer gave me exactly 30 minutes to arrive at a warehouse in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with a written confession, or the medical transport currently holding my mother would cease its life support functions due to a regrettable mechanical failure. Panic seized my chest like a vice, overriding all logic and reason, and I scrambled to my feet with the desperate instinct of a daughter who was willing to burn the world to save the only person who ever loved her. I rushed toward the door, screaming that I would sign anything and say anything, my mind already formulating the lies I would tell the press to free the monster who was killing my family. Damon stepped in front of the door, blocking my path with his broad frame, his face set in a mask of cold fury that terrified me more than the lawyer's threat. I pounded on his chest with my fists, screaming at him to move, scratching at his expensive suit in a frenzy of grief and desperation, begging him to let me go before it was too late. I told him that I did not care about his company or his revenge or the contract. I only cared that my mother was dying in a cold van somewhere in the snow while we wasted time. Damon grabbed my wrists to restrain me, but when I continued to thrash and scream that I would destroy the evidence, his hand connected sharply with my cheek, the sting silencing my hysteria instantly and snapping my head to the side. The room fell into a shocking silence, broken only by my ragged breathing and the hum of the backup generator. As I stared at him with wide eyes, my hand flying to the red mark on my face, he grabbed my shoulders and shook me once, his voice low and intense, telling me that if I walked into that warehouse alone, I would be dead within 5 minutes and my mother would die anyway because Marcus never leaves loose ends. He told me that I was no longer a victim named Elena Vance who could be bullied into submission. I was Elena Blackwood. And in his world we did not negotiate with terrorists. We eliminated them. He wiped a tear from my cheek with a rough thumb and told me that his team had just triangulated the GPS signal of the ambulance. And we were going to get her back on our terms. Not theirs. I nodded slowly, the pain in my cheek grounding me in reality, realizing that he was right, and that surrender was just a slower form of suicide. We sped toward the Brooklyn Navy Yard in a convoy of 3 black SUVs, the city blurring past in streaks of gray and white as the snow continued to fall relentlessly. Damon sat beside me, checking the load of a handgun with practiced ease, a sight that should have terrified me but instead gave me a strange sense of comfort, knowing that violence was finally being directed at the people who deserved it. The warehouse district was a graveyard of rusted metal and abandoned dreams, looming out of the fog like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. We pulled up to a dilapidated loading dock, where a white van was parked with its engine running, the exhaust puffing white clouds into the freezing air. Damon's security team moved with the silent efficiency of wolves, surrounding the perimeter and breaching the side entrance before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt. I heard the sounds of a brief struggle, the thud of bodies hitting concrete, and then the signal from the lead guard that the area was clear. I scrambled out of the car and ran toward the van, slipping on the icy pavement, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I prayed to a god I had long abandoned. I tore open the rear doors of the ambulance, expecting to see a team of doctors or at least a nurse monitoring the equipment. But the interior was dark and abandoned. The driver and the attendant had fled the scene moments before the raid, leaving their cargo behind like discarded trash. My mother lay on the gurney with a stillness that was unnatural, the portable ventilator silent and dark beside her like a tombstone, its battery light blinking a menacing red indicating it had been drained for some time. I climbed inside and grabbed her cold hand, frantically searching for a pulse, pressing my ear to her chest, begging her to breathe, to move, to give me any sign that she was still fighting. But her skin was the color of marble and just as cold, and her chest remained still, the silence of her heart deafening in the cramped space. I fell to my knees beside the gurney, a scream building in my chest that was too large for my throat, a sound of pure primal agony that shattered the last remnants of my hope. Damon climbed in behind me and placed a hand on my mother's neck, checking for a pulse that we both knew wasn't there, his face darkening with a rage that matched my own. He did not pull me away or tell me to calm down. He simply stood guard at the doors of the van while I wept over the body of the woman who had sacrificed everything for me. I realized with a clarity that cut through the grief like a knife that Marcus had never intended to let her live. He had used her as a pawn and discarded her the moment she became inconvenient. The lawyer's call had been a distraction, a cruel game to make me destroy myself while my mother was already freezing to death in an abandoned parking lot. I stood up slowly, wiping the tears from my face with a hand that no longer trembled, feeling the warmth of the baby kicking inside me, a reminder that life and death were dancing a cruel tango in my body. I looked at Damon and told him that I did not want to sue Marcus Sterling anymore, and I did not want to put him in prison where he could eventually be paroled. I told him that I wanted to burn everything Marcus loved. I wanted to strip him of his name, his money, his legacy, and his hope, until he was left with nothing but the cold darkness he had forced my mother into. Damon looked at me with a grim respect, nodding once as he took out his phone to call the coroner, confirming that the war had just escalated from a corporate takeover to a blood feud. The funeral service for my mother was held under a slate-gray sky that wept a freezing drizzle onto the black umbrellas of the gathered mourners, a fitting backdrop for the burial of a woman who had known little warmth in her final years. Damon had arranged for the ceremony to take place at Trinity Churchyard, a location reserved for the city's elite, transforming my mother's passing from a tragic statistic into a high-profile social event that commanded the attention of the entire eastern seaboard. I stood by the open grave wearing a black dress that concealed my swelling stomach, my face hidden behind a veil of dark lace that Damon had selected not for modesty, but to create an aura of untouchable grief. I did not cry, for my tear ducts felt cauterized by the white-hot rage that had been burning in my chest since the moment I saw her empty bed in the warehouse. The attendees were a mix of Damon's business associates who came to pay respects to the new power couple, and curious socialites who wanted to witness the fallout of the Sterling scandal firsthand. They whispered behind their gloved hands, their eyes darting between me and the gate, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the villain in this tragedy. Damon stood beside me like a sentinel carved from granite, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. A silent reminder that I was no longer fighting this war alone. He leaned down and whispered that the live stream cameras were rolling, and the world was waiting to see if I would break or if I would bite. A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave of nausea as a black sedan with tinted windows rolled up the gravel path, blatantly ignoring the security cordon that Damon had established. Marcus Sterling stepped out of the vehicle wearing a suit of midnight blue and an expression of practiced sorrow that he must have rehearsed in front of a mirror for hours. He had posted bail of $5 million just 2 hours ago, using the last of his liquid assets to buy a temporary freedom so he could perform damage control on his crumbling reputation. He walked toward the gravesite carrying a massive bouquet of white lilies, the very flower my mother had been allergic to, a detail he had never bothered to learn in 10 years of marriage. The crowd parted for him, half in shock and half in morbid fascination, as he approached the woman whose death he had orchestrated with a signature on a transfer order. He stopped a few feet from me and bowed his head, his voice cracking with a theatrical emotion as he claimed that he was devastated by the loss of his beloved mother-in-law. He looked directly into the news cameras and stated that her death was a tragic medical accident caused by the power failure, and that he had only been trying to move her to a better facility when her heart gave out. I watched him perform his soliloquy with the detachment of a surgeon observing a tumor, noting how he carefully positioned himself to look like the grieving patriarch who was being unfairly persecuted. He reached out to place the lilies on the casket, his hand trembling slightly in a bid for sympathy. But before the flowers could touch the wood, I stepped forward and intercepted his arm. The contact was electric, not with passion but with the repulsion of touching something rotting and unclean. I did not scream or shout. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single piece of paper, the transport log that Damon's team had recovered from the abandoned ambulance. I stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for the eulogy, the feedback whine slicing through the silence of the cemetery, and I looked Marcus dead in the eye. I spoke to the cameras with a voice that was devoid of emotion, reading the timeline of events that proved my mother had died 20 minutes before the ambulance even left the hospital loading dock. I revealed that the cause of death listed on the preliminary coroner's report was not heart failure, but asphyxiation due to the manual disconnection of her ventilator. The silence in the graveyard was absolute, broken only by the shutter clicks of 100 cameras capturing the moment Marcus's mask slipped to reveal the panic underneath. I continued my indictment, turning to the crowd and explaining that my husband did not move my mother to save her. He moved her to hide her because he knew the FBI was coming for his tax records. I held up the log and declared that he had treated a human life like an incriminating document that needed to be shredded before the audit. Marcus lunged forward, his face twisting into a snarl of desperation, shouting that I was hysterical and hormonal, trying to grab the microphone to silence the truth that was destroying him. But Damon was faster, stepping between us and shoving Marcus back with a force that sent him stumbling onto the wet grass, staining his expensive suit with mud. The security team materialized from the shadows, forming a human wall between the mourners and the man who had just been exposed as a murderer in all but legal name. I looked down at him, sprawled in the dirt, and told him that he could buy his way out of jail, but he could not buy his way out of this grave. Marcus scrambled to his feet, looking around for support. But the faces that greeted him were no longer curious or neutral. They were filled with open disgust and condemnation. Even his own lawyers who had accompanied him looked down at their shoes, realizing that their client had just committed social suicide on live television. Damon pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward Marcus, displaying the real-time stock ticker for Sterling Enterprises. The line on the graph was plummeting vertically, a red streak of financial hemorrhage as shareholders dumped their stock in a panic fueled by the revelations at the graveside. Damon announced calmly that the board of directors had just called an emergency meeting and were voting to remove Marcus as CEO effective immediately, citing the moral turpitude clause in his contract. Marcus stared at the screen, his face draining of color as he realized that the empire he had killed to protect was dissolving like sugar in hot water. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and fear, realizing for the first time that the wife he had discarded was the architect of his ruin. He tried to salvage the situation by turning to the cameras and playing his final card, shouting that I was mentally unstable and unfit to be a mother, claiming that the child I carried was in danger due to my erratic behavior. He pointed a shaking finger at my stomach and vowed that he would petition the family court for full custody of his heir to protect the baby from my madness. The crowd gasped at the audacity of the threat, but I simply placed a protective hand over my unborn child and smiled a cold, humorless smile. I leaned into the microphone one last time and told him that he was welcome to try, but he should remember that in the state of New York, a convicted felon and a bankrupt man had very little chance of winning custody against a billionaire's wife. I turned my back on him and dropped a single red rose onto my mother's coffin, a symbol of the blood that had been spilled and the vengeance that was just beginning. The security guards escorted Marcus out of the cemetery as the crowd parted to let him pass, not out of respect, but to avoid being contaminated by his failure. As the gates closed behind him, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, the heavy burden of fear replaced by the steely resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The final nail in the coffin of Marcus Sterling's reputation was hammered not by a judge or a jury, but by the woman he had intended to marry for her billions. I sat in the safety of Damon's armored limousine watching the live broadcast on the embedded screen, where Chloe Vanderbilt stood before a phalanx of microphones outside her family's estate, looking every inch the victim of a manipulative fraud. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and announced to the world that she was terminating her engagement to Marcus, effective immediately, citing his moral bankruptcy and a newly discovered cache of photos, proving his infidelity during their courtship. She called him a parasite who had preyed on her innocence, and to ensure he could never rise again, she leaked a series of audio recordings where Marcus had mocked her intelligence and called her father a senile old cash cow. The internet exploded with vitriol, turning Marcus from a disgraced CEO into a social pariah who could not even walk down Fifth Avenue without being spat upon. I turned off the screen feeling a hollow satisfaction, knowing that while I had lit the match, it was his own greed that had poured the gasoline. However, Damon did not share my relief. He remained tense and alert, tapping his fingers on his knee as he watched the snowy streets of New York blur past the tinted windows. He warned me that we had stripped a narcissist of his mask, his money, and his future, which meant he was no longer a rational actor playing a corporate game, but a wounded beast with nothing left to lose but his freedom. Marcus sat in the dim light of a grimy basement in Queens, the smell of stale beer and damp mold filling his nose, a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms he was accustomed to. He had been rejected by every bank, every friend, and every lawyer in the city, leaving him with only one option to secure the funds he needed to flee the country. He sat across from a man known simply as the Shark, a loan shark who operated in the shadows where credit scores did not matter, only collateral in flesh and blood. Marcus laid his Rolex and his diamond cufflinks on the scarred wooden table, but the Shark merely laughed and swept them onto the floor with a dismissive wave of his hand. Marcus swallowed his pride and offered the only asset he had left, which was the unborn child currently growing inside his ex-wife. A child he claimed was the heir to the Sterling Trust Fund, which he could access once he had custody. He promised the gangster 50% of the trust if they helped him stage an accident that would eliminate the mother while leaving the child viable for extraction. The Shark looked at him with cold, dead eyes and agreed to the terms. handing over a briefcase of cash and a burner phone, sealing a deal that traded a human life for a getaway ticket. Marcus walked out into the snow, his eyes burning with the madness of a man who believed he was reclaiming his property, unaware that he had just sold his soul for a rental car and a hit squad. The storm had intensified into a whiteout blizzard as our convoy navigated the winding roads leading out of the city toward the safe house in the Hamptons. Damon had insisted we leave Manhattan until the FBI finished sweeping the Sterling properties, fearing that Marcus might try something desperate in the city center. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, my hand instinctively protecting my stomach where the baby was kicking with a restless energy, as if sensing the danger that lurked in the swirling white darkness. Suddenly, the headlights of a massive heavy-duty truck appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching at a speed that was reckless for the icy conditions. Damon checked the side mirrors and cursed under his breath, grabbing the radio to alert the security detail in the trailing vehicle. But all we heard was static and the sickening crunch of metal on metal from behind us. I turned to look and saw our escort SUV being rammed off the road by the truck, spinning violently into the guardrail before tumbling down the snowy embankment into the darkness below. Panic seized my throat as Damon shouted at our driver to evade, his voice cutting through the chaos with the command of a general under fire. Our driver floored the accelerator, the massive engine of the limousine roaring as it fought for traction on the slick asphalt. But the truck was relentless, its grille looming larger like the jaws of a mechanical monster. Another vehicle, a black sedan with no license plates, swerved out from a side road to block our path, forcing us to swerve dangerously close to the edge of the cliff that dropped down to the frozen Hudson River. Damon unbuckled his seatbelt and threw his body over mine, using himself as a human shield as he anticipated the impact that we both knew was inevitable. The truck rammed into the rear of our car with the force of a freight train, the sound of crushing metal and shattering glass deafening in the confined space. The world spun violently as our car lost control, skidding sideways across the ice before crashing through the guardrail and plunging down the steep slope. We rolled once, twice, the interior of the car turning into a centrifuge of violence and noise, before coming to a jarring halt against a cluster of ancient pine trees. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hissing of the radiator and the distant sound of car doors slamming shut on the road above us. I drifted back to consciousness with the taste of copper in my mouth and a searing pain tearing through my lower abdomen that felt like a hot knife twisting inside me. The airbags had deployed, filling the cabin with a white dust that burned my eyes and throat, making it hard to see in the gloom. I turned my head slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and saw Damon slumped against the shattered window, a stream of dark liquid running down the side of his face from a gash on his temple. I shook his shoulder frantically, calling his name, but he did not stir, his breathing shallow and ragged in the freezing air that was rushing in through the broken glass. I tried to move my legs, but they were pinned under the crushed dashboard, trapping me in the wreckage like a specimen in a jar. Then I heard the crunch of boots on the snow, slow and deliberate, approaching the wreck not with the urgency of rescuers but with the predatory pace of executioners. A voice drifted down from the slope, a voice I recognized with a chill that went deeper than the winter cold, asking his hired thugs if the incubator was still intact. Marcus had not come to save his wife or his child. He had come to harvest an asset from the debris of the life he had destroyed. The pain in my stomach intensified, shifting from a constant ache to a rhythmic contraction that stole the breath from my lungs. And I realized with a terrifying clarity that the trauma of the crash had triggered labor. My water broke, soaking the expensive leather of the seat and mixing with the blood and the snow, signaling that my child was coming into the world in the middle of a frozen hell. I reached under the seat and my fingers brushed against the cold metal of the handgun Damon kept for emergencies, a heavy object that felt alien in my hand. I gripped it tightly, the adrenaline overriding the pain and the fear, transforming me from a victim into a mother who would kill to protect her young. I watched the shadows of 3 men descend the slope, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, searching for the prize they had been promised. I realized that Damon was unconscious. The security team was gone, and I was the only thing standing between my baby and the monster who wanted to steal him. I wiped the blood from my eyes and aimed the weapon at the shattered window, whispering a promise to my unborn child that he would not take his first breath in the arms of a devil. The contraction seized my body with the force of a tectonic shift, ripping a guttural cry from my throat that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind and the metallic groan of the twisted chassis. I gripped the cold steel of the handgun with both hands, my knuckles turning white as I aimed through the shattered window at the silhouette of Marcus Sterling, who was descending the slope like a vulture coming to pick clean a carcass. He stopped 10 feet from the wreckage, his expensive Italian loafers sinking into the bloody snow, and gestured to the 2 thugs behind him with a casual flick of his wrist that reduced me and my child to a logistical problem to be solved. He shouted over the wind that they should cut me out of the seat if necessary. But the priority was to secure the asset before it froze to death or before the police arrived to complicate his custody claim. The sheer inhumanity of his words, referring to his own flesh and blood as an asset to be harvested from a dying woman, flipped a switch in my brain that turned off the fear and left only a cold, predatory rage. I waited until the first thug reached for the door handle, his face covered by a ski mask, and I pulled the trigger, the recoil sending a shockwave of pain through my injured shoulder. The gunshot cracked through the winter air like a whip, and the man screamed as he clutched his thigh, collapsing onto the ice in a heap of dark clothing and cursing. Marcus froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as he realized that the helpless victim he had come to rob was armed and ready to drag him down to hell with her. I tried to fire again, but a fresh wave of labor pain paralyzed my arm, forcing me to drop the gun onto the blood-stained dashboard as my body convulsed in an agonizing rhythm that I could no longer control. The second thug, realizing I was incapacitated by the birth, lunged forward with a crowbar to smash the remaining glass, his intent clear in the way he raised the weapon above his head. I closed my eyes and curled around my stomach, bracing for the blow that would end us. But instead of the impact of steel on glass, I heard a sickening thud and a gargled cry of surprise. I opened my eyes to see Damon Blackwood moving with the desperate speed of a wounded animal, his hand gripping the thug's wrist through the broken window, twisting the arm until the bone snapped with a dry crunch that was audible even over the storm. Damon had regained consciousness in the chaos, his face a mask of blood and fury, shaking off the concussion to defend what was his with a brutality that matched the violence of the night. He snatched the gun from the dashboard with his free hand and fired 2 shots in rapid succession. Not to kill, but to shatter the thug's kneecaps, sending the man crumbling to the ground in a pool of his own agony. Damon turned to me, his eyes clearing as he took in the situation, realizing that we were trapped in a steel coffin while a new life was forcing its way out into the freezing darkness. Marcus screamed at his hired muscle to get up and finish the job, but the men were writhing in the snow, incapacitated by the precise violence Damon had inflicted. The cowardice that defined Marcus's entire existence took over, and instead of attacking us himself, he began to back away toward the slope, his eyes darting around for an escape route as the sound of distant sirens began to pierce the night. But I could not focus on his retreat because my body was tearing itself apart, the pressure in my pelvis becoming unbearable as the baby crowned, demanding entry into a world that was trying to kill it. Damon dropped the gun and leaned over me, his large hands trembling slightly as he checked the position of the baby, his voice dropping to a soothing low timbre that anchored me in the storm. He told me that I had to push right now, regardless of the pain or the cold or the fear, because if the baby did not come out in the next 2 minutes, the stress would stop its heart. I looked at him, seeing the blood dripping from his forehead onto his white shirt, and I nodded, gathering every ounce of strength left in my battered body. I screamed, a sound that was raw and primal, pushing against the pain, pushing against the wreckage, pushing against the cruelty of the man who had abandoned us. The baby slid into Damon's waiting hands just as the blinding blue and red lights of federal law enforcement vehicles flooded the ravine from the road above, turning the snow into a kaleidoscope of authority and rescue. A thin, high-pitched wail cut through the roar of the wind, a sound of pure life that brought tears to my eyes and made Damon's stoic face crumble into an expression of profound awe. He quickly wrapped the infant in his suit jacket, using his own body heat to shield the tiny form from the biting sub-zero temperatures, while he cut the umbilical cord with a pocket knife he had retrieved from his glove compartment. I reached out with weak arms and he placed our son on my chest, the warmth of the small body seeping into my frozen skin, proving that we had won the ultimate victory against death. On the slope above, Marcus was attempting to scramble up the icy embankment to reach his car, slipping and sliding in a pathetic display of panic. A spotlight from a hovering police helicopter pinned him against the white snow like an insect under a microscope, and a voice from a loudspeaker ordered him to surrender immediately. He froze, raising his hands in the air, a defeated figure, small and insignificant against the vast machinery of justice that he had thought he could buy. The FBI agents descended the slope with tactical precision, weapons drawn, surrounding Marcus and forcing him to his knees in the slush, stripping him of his dignity as efficiently as they stripped him of his freedom. They did not treat him like a billionaire CEO. They treated him like the domestic terrorist he had become, cuffing his hands behind his back and dragging him toward the waiting transport van. One of the agents, a woman with a grim expression, stopped by the wreckage to assist the paramedics who were now swarming the car with the jaws of life to cut us free. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, I turned my head to see Marcus being shoved into the back of the police vehicle, his eyes meeting mine for one brief second. There was no defiance left in them, only the hollow realization that he had gambled his soul and lost everything to the woman he had underestimated. The paramedic placed an oxygen mask over my face, telling me to breathe deeply, but I was already breathing easier than I had in years. The suffocating weight of Marcus Sterling finally lifted from my chest. Damon climbed into the ambulance beside me, refusing medical attention for his own head wound until he was sure the baby and I were hooked up to the monitors. He held my hand tightly, his grip warm and solid, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. The ride to the hospital was a blur of lights and medical jargon, but the fear was gone, replaced by a fierce protective love for the bundle of blankets sleeping in the incubator next to me. The news reports were already breaking on the radio in the front of the ambulance, announcing that the disgraced tycoon Marcus Sterling had been apprehended at the scene of an attempted murder, and that federal prosecutors were adding charges of conspiracy and racketeering to his indictment. The reporter mentioned that new evidence provided by his ex-wife had linked him to an underground loan shark ring, ensuring that he would face decades in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. I looked at Damon, who was watching the baby with a fascination that softened the sharp angles of his face, and I asked him what we would name the boy who had been born in a wreck. Damon looked at me, then at the child, and whispered that we should name him Phoenix, because he had risen from the ashes of a fire that was meant to burn us all to the ground. I nodded, tears finally spilling onto my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that the winter was over, and the spring had finally come. 3 years had passed since the night I gave birth in a wreckage of twisted metal and snow, and the world had turned on its axis to place me at the very top of the food chain. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the 52nd floor office that once belonged to Marcus Sterling, looking down at the ant-like cars crawling through the streets of Manhattan. The room had been stripped of his heavy mahogany furniture and pretension, replaced with sleek glass and white marble that reflected the sunlight, symbolizing the transparency and strength of the new regime. I was no longer the trembling woman who begged for money to save her mother. I was the CEO of Vance Blackwood Global, a conglomerate that had risen from the ashes of the Sterling Empire and consumed its competitors with a ruthless efficiency. On the desk behind me lay the signed acquisition papers for the Vanderbilt Media Group, the final piece of my revenge against the woman who had once spilled wine on my dress. I picked up the gold fountain pen, the same one I had used to sign the contract marriage, and traced the signature that was now worth billions of dollars. My secretary buzzed in to inform me that the board of directors was waiting for my quarterly address, her voice filled with the reverence reserved for royalty. I smoothed the skirt of my bespoke suit, checking my reflection in the glass, seeing not a survivor, but a conqueror who had built a fortress out of the stones thrown at her. While I commanded the boardroom in a suit of armor made by Chanel, Marcus Sterling was rotting in a 6-by-8-foot cell in the maximum security wing of the Otisville Correctional Facility. He sat on the edge of a thin mattress that smelled of mildew and despair, staring at the small communal television that was bolted to the wall behind a cage of steel mesh. The news anchor was announcing the Businesswoman of the Year, and Marcus watched with hollow eyes as my face filled the screen, radiating health and power that he had never been able to extinguish. The report cut to footage of me cutting the ribbon on the Vance Memorial Hospital, a state-of-the-art medical center dedicated to providing free care to those who could not afford it. Named in honor of the woman Marcus had killed. He saw the way the public cheered for me, the way the shareholders worshipped the ground I walked on, and the bitter bile of regret rose in his throat like acid. He looked at his hands, which were rough from prison labor and empty of the gold rings he used to wear, realizing that he had held a diamond in his palm and thrown it away to chase a handful of gravel. The other inmates ignored him, for in here he was not a CEO or a visionary. He was just another number in a beige jumpsuit who cried himself to sleep when the lights went out. The heavy oak doors of my office swung open without a knock, and the sound of small running feet echoed on the marble floor, shattering the professional silence with a burst of pure joy. A 3-year-old boy with messy dark hair and eyes as sharp as his father's sprinted across the room, ignoring the multi-million-dollar artwork to wrap his arms around my legs. I lifted Phoenix into my arms, inhaling the scent of baby shampoo and innocence, feeling the solid weight of the life that Marcus had tried to treat as a disposable asset. Damon Blackwood followed him inside, closing the door to shut out the world, his presence filling the room with the warm familiarity of a partner who had fought back-to-back with me in the trenches. The scar on his temple from the car accident had faded to a thin white line, a mark of honor that reminded us daily of the price we had paid for this happiness. Damon walked over and kissed my forehead, his hand resting on the small of my back with a possessiveness that had shifted from contractual obligation to a deep and abiding love. He told me that the car was waiting downstairs to take us to the Hamptons for the weekend, and that he had confiscated my work phone because even empresses needed a day off. I looked at the 2 men in my life, the husband who had saved me from the snow and the son who had been born in the fire, and I realized that the contract I had signed that night had been the best deal of my life. I walked over to the window one last time, holding Phoenix on my hip while Damon stood beside me, his arm draped over my shoulders as we looked out at the city we now owned. I thought of Marcus in his cage. I thought of Chloe in her bankruptcy. And I thought of my mother watching from somewhere beyond the cold. I whispered to Phoenix that the world was a cruel place filled with storms and monsters. But as long as we stood together, we would always be the ones who controlled the lightning. The sun began to set over the Hudson River, bathing the skyline in a golden light that washed away the memories of the blizzard, leaving only the warmth of the victory. I turned away from the window and walked out of the office with my family, leaving the ghosts of the past locked in the dark, while we stepped into a future that was bright, limitless, and entirely ours.